Thanks so much for having me, man. I am Dave Edwards. I am currently the head of revenue at Audiomack, which is a music streaming app and platform, which is direct to fan for artists. And I also was a music producer before I joined Audiomack and worked a bit and interned a bit at labels before that. So, really been in the music business. I'm 38 now, since I was about 16. So, most of my life I've been doing music in one form or another.
Yeah. That's awesome, man. Thank you for that intro. I have a couple. The main reason I actually wanted you on the podcast is because I saw a bunch of your tweets about AI and music, and I
Mhm.
saw that you were super interested in it, and I'm super interested in the space as well. I'm trying to learn as much as I can. Um, but I found your page to be a really good source of like interacting with the right people for that space, and then also having your own ideas and opinions of where that space is. And then aside from that,
Mhm.
obviously you're the head of revenue at Audiomack, which is awesome. I've never had anyone of that type of position on this podcast yet. I haven't really talked to anyone in that type of position, so I'd love to first talk about that and know, what it is that you do there, and your experience there.
Sure. So, I mean, at its most basic level, my job is ultimately to make sure that we get our artists on audio paid as much as we can. So I oversee all of our different revenue channels. So to kind of break those down from a high level, we have advertising, which is kind of number one for us. We are a mostly ad supported platform.
Mm,
So that is both in the U.S. and abroad, selling deals with companies like McDonald's, whether they want to make original music, they want to run ads on our platform, things like that.
mm,
We obviously have our premium business as well. So I oversee that. I'm responsible for helping us to grow that entire part of the company. And then we also have another part of our ad business, which is called programmatic advertising, which is similar to what you might see on other platforms like Meta, where there's kind of like a real time auction as you're about to see an ad impression if it's not direct sold. So yeah, it's basically doing all these different things, as well as here and there some strategic partnerships, which ultimately drive revenue. So yeah, my job at the end of the day is just to do everything I can to make sure that revenue is looking good, which obviously flows back to our artists, partners, our label partners, rights holders, publishers, and kind of everyone downstream of that. So, yeah, for me, it's kind of like a nice natural evolution of my career. Like I was a producer for years, and now I like to think of my job as helping artists get paid. Audiomack is, to my knowledge, like the only free platform that offers what we do. You don't need to go through a distribution company to put your music on Audiomack. You can just upload it right on our creator app. We're free for artists. We don't have like a premium tier for artists. We do for listeners, but not for artists. So if you have, as long as you own the rights to them, obviously, whether you have one song or 1,000, you can upload all of them for free. You get advanced stats, private links, all those types of things. So yeah, we try to be really artist friendly, and that's really been our lane since I joined in about 2013. And so, yeah, I think just the simple way to put it is my job is just to do everything I can to make sure that
mm.
revenue is as high as it can be, so that our artists and rights holders get the most they can.
Yeah, that's really cool. But that sounds just even the as little as I know about it, that sounds like a really, really difficult job because it sounds like there's a lot of factors that play into that, and obviously there's probably a lot of opposing factors that are in play at all times. And then on top of
Yeah.
that, you have this ever changing landscape. Um, is what's happening right now with AI, is that something that you're already kind of preparing for or making adjustments to regarding your role at Audiomack, or is that not something that you're dealing with right now?
I think yes and no. I mean, I think where I see a lot of disruption coming from music from the AI front is on the amount of music that's being produced. I mean, I think this is something that I definitely tweet about. In the year 2000, there were about 1.5 million songs that came to market that entire year. And there are now, as of a few months ago, before a lot of these AI tools even cropped up, you were seeing over 100,000 songs hit Spotify every day. So every
Oh,
15 days, probably now more like every 13 or 12 days, you have an equivalent volume of music coming out and hitting Obviously, streaming didn't exist in the year 2000, but there's more music coming out every 2 weeks than in an entire year a couple decades ago. And I think you're going to see that multiply several times over in just the next year or two. I mean, you see AI tools like Boomi, they've cranked out 14 million songs according to their website in about a year, I believe. So
Hmm.
I think we're going to get to a point in not very long where, unless there are changes on streaming apps, that 100,000 songs per day number is going to go up to maybe 500,000, a million. I know that sounds crazy, but at some point you're just going to have so many people making music that
Yeah.
there's just going to be an incredible amount of music coming in. So I think as a company, we're definitely trying to think about that. And it's not easy, right? Because there's considerations on whatever like viewpoint you're looking at that from, right? I mean, if you're a artist who was an artist before this kind of AI generation, I think there's a lot of legitimate reasons to be a bit frustrated about some of those things I just described and
Yeah.
have some anxiety about that. Like, wait a minute. Like, I can tell you, I mean, I literally put in my 10,000 hours. I think you have too. And like,
Hmm.
I'm not producing these days anymore, but like, if I were, I'd probably feel some type of way about that. I'd be like, wait a
Yeah.
minute. I sacrificed so much time and things in my life to get really good at this. And now like anyone can just do this with like a phone and an app. Like what? Like
Yeah.
that doesn't feel fair. But
Yeah.
what's interesting is I saw the same exact thing happen when I started producing, because when I was growing up, nobody that I knew, and I'd never even heard of someone like, for example, going home after school and like making beats. Like that just was not a thing
Yeah.
for in the way that it is now. And now, I was more of like an EDM house producer. And in the last decade, you saw these kids like Madion come up. They were like, I think he blew up when he was like 15 years old. Like he definitely wasn't
Hmm.
even old enough to get into the clubs he was playing.
Yeah.
And so there's just been this huge sea change with apps like Ableton and Logic and Fruity Loops coming out that just allow you to make music on your laptop. And I remember when I started using those, I heard the same thing that people are saying about AI from the prior generation who had never used the DAW and were like, oh, that's cheating. Like you can just like comp stuff, you can do
Hmm.
all this. Like I do it the old school way on tape. And so I don't know. There are some similarities there. I'm not saying they're equivalent. I do think AI definitely like
Yeah.
it's kind of an exponential extension of what
Yeah.
Ableton was, right? It's like it goes like, and like we were just discussing, you still needed with Ableton to put in your 10,000 hours. Like you still needed to work so hard to get good at it. I do think
Hmm.
there's an obvious distinction there, at least for me, between just clicking a button and generating a song and putting in all that work. But to some extent, there is a similarity there, right? Where it's like,
Right.
this is going to open up making music to many more people. You're seeing TikTok really actively work on this right now. And so I think there's just going to be this enormous kind of flood of content coming out to streaming platforms, and not just in music. I think you're going to see it on YouTube and Twitch and kind of
Hmm.
everywhere. So yeah, we're definitely trying to think about how we handle that content. Do we, for one thing, for a streaming platform, whether it's Audiomack, whether it's Spotify, in the past, we've always looked at the storage required to store a song is pretty minimal, right? Like even a WAV file, let's
Hmm.
call it like 40 megabytes, like that's not a big deal. Storage has gotten very cheap.
Hmm.
But if you like 20x the amount that you're storing every month because everyone's uploading like a million songs a day, that can start to change. And
Yeah.
bear in mind that Audiomack does a lot less of this, but when you're talking about a platform like Spotify, one of the reasons that a lot of people use Spotify is that their recommender system is so good. That's powered by machine learning itself, which means
Right.
for a song to be recommended, it has to be run through their system so it can kind of learn the song's characteristics. There's a cost to that. There's a compute cost to that. So it's just a lot of the things that kind of made
Hmm.
streaming work for the past decade are going to start breaking down. And so I think it's going to be interesting to see
Interesting.
how different platforms approach that.
That's really interesting. Yeah. 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 I never thought about that. I never thought about that angle. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think a lot of people did. I mean, I think even people at Spotify, I think everyone's been we all kind of I think everyone in music tech kind of knew that AI was coming in some form or another. I definitely I started talking about this on Twitter a couple of years ago, and it's been funny to see the change because I still recall that the first time I brought this up on Twitter, like some people yelled at me and were like, "Nobody's ever going to want to listen to AI music," and it's like, look at this Drake
Hmm.
song, man. Like lots of
Yeah.
people do, and maybe it
Yeah.
was just a novelty. I don't know, but you see that was less than 2 years ago when I started talking about that stuff, and you see how much stuff has changed. But I think for me, when I saw the visual tools that were dropping last year, like Midjourney and Dolly, I was like, all
Yeah,
right, how long is it till this comes for music? Because
it's
ultimately, it's a
crazy.
very
Yeah,
similar problem, right?
a hundred
You're
percent.
training, yeah, you're training a model on some creative output that a lot of people have made, and there's a lot of issues around that that I'm pretty vocal about that we can get into. But yeah, it's just moving very quick, and so I think most streaming platforms are just caught a bit off guard right now.
Yeah,
I think that Drake song, the Drake AI song, the Ghostwriter one that kind of went pretty viral. It just definitely, yeah. I think the best way to put it is it caught a lot of people off guard. A lot of people in the
makes
industry
sense.
on the label side, and I think on the tech side, definitely thought of AI as something that was coming. I'm just not sure they realized it was coming in like April of
Yeah,
2023. You know what I mean?
yeah,
Like I
that
think
makes
it
total
was like, oh,
sense.
we'll deal with
Yeah,
this in a couple of years, and then it's like,
yeah,
no, this is here right now.
that makes total sense. Yeah, I don't think anyone. I mean, I don't want to say anyone, but like no one that I was, it's something that I was always interested in, but never, I thought it would take some time for this, at least
Yeah,
even the technology we're seeing now. I thought it would take some time for that to show up, but we're seeing it. And not only are we seeing it, we're seeing the improvements made on it get really crazy fast.
yeah,
And I totally agree with what you're saying after seeing Midjourney and Dali. And I don't know, I'm sure you've seen Gen 2. Gen
yeah.
2.
Runway
So
is incredible.
yeah,
Yeah,
so I mean, it's like if I would argue, to me, it seems like the stuff that Midjourney's doing is harder. Again, I don't know enough about the actual what goes behind, audio ML and image generation from text, but it seems like that should be harder what they're doing, arguably. So the music stuff, I'm
yeah.
sure, I know I've seen some stuff with Google and they're working on some things, but it seems like it's probably already here, if not, right around the corner, as you're saying. So, um,
Right.
yeah, I mean, it is interesting the times that we're heading into, and I agree with what you're saying regarding AI being a tool and a new technology, and people have kind of the same sentiment as, we can look at history and see people having similar things, similar viewpoints on other technologies. But I agree that AI is more of an exponential change, and it's definitely a more of a drastic change, and it has far greater implications than just like a singular DAW. Um,
Oh, for sure, for sure.
so there's a lot there. Yeah,
Yeah, and I
yeah.
think to your point about Midjourney, I mean, if people are listening to this and they haven't done this or haven't seen this, the craziest, maybe I'll put this up on Twitter today, but the craziest thing to me in consumer facing AI is Midjourney. And specifically, I believe version one of Midjourney came out last July, maybe last June, but I'm pretty sure it was last July. So we're like 9 months out from that, let's call it. And if you there's been people posting threads recently since Midjourney 5 came out. Midjourney 5 is just insane. It's basically photorealistic. Like depending on the styling, sometimes you can tell that it's not an actual photo, but if you put in the right prompt and you want something
Oh, for sure.
photorealistic, like I don't know,
Yeah,
man. With
yeah,
5.1, you can get basically there.
yeah.
And there's been people doing these tweet threads about here's the same prompt in Midjourney version 1 9 months ago. Here it is today. And like
Oh,
the version
wow.
from 9 months ago is like basically a stick figure by comparison, right? It's
Yeah.
like basically if you're like, I want a car, like it's basically the outline of a car and some colors. And you're like, okay, that's cool. I can describe an image. And here
Mm-hmm.
we are 9 months later, and it's like, no, now you can literally make a photo of a Ferrari that looks like a photo of a Ferrari.
Yeah.
And you can then, you mentioned Gen 2 with Runway, but even with Gen 1 with Runway,
Mm-hmm.
you can then, I'm sure you've seen this on Twitter as well, that there's people who will generate a lot of frames, like individual frames to make a movie
Okay.
out of with something like Midjourney. And then
Mm-hmm.
Runway has a tool that allows you to take a bunch of those images and make them into a video. So make it basically animated and
Oh,
interpolate the changes.
I didn't know they had
So
that. Okay.
there's crazy stuff I've seen on Twitter where people are making like mini music videos and it's all generated. It's all like it's
Hmm.
individual images that they then put into Runway. And so to your point, yeah, I think they're both hard problems to solve, but yeah, I don't think that graphics, or I don't think that music is harder to solve than graphics. So yeah,
Yeah.
I would fully expect that this stuff is very close and is, I know some people working on stuff in the space, and I think by the end of this year, you're going to see some really pretty crazy tools out there. And yeah, I think both for music creators, like I think there's a lot to discuss there. I think for the industry, there's a lot to discuss, but it's going to be really disruptive. And I definitely don't know exactly how. I think it's like always a fool's errand trying to predict the future, especially with something that's moving this quickly. But I think there are some trends that are pretty obvious that we're starting to see, and I definitely hope that the industry as a whole starts having kind of a real conversation around artist rights, royalties, name and likeness, and using someone's kind of personal brand. We need to be having those. I mean, we really should have been having those conversations like 2 years ago, but
Yeah,
we need to have them now. Like now is the next best time.
for sure. Yeah, I mean, and I've seen you be quite vocal about that on Twitter as well, regarding just property, like artist property, and what's
Yeah,
what's right and what's wrong, and the directions we should be going with that. I totally agree, and I think it does get very weird, but I mean, I agree that we need to be having those conversations. Um, yeah, and regarding the disruption too, like it's just I know a lot of people that make really good predictions, I guess, about certain technologies in the future. But one thing with this, and I see more and more of this, is there's no what's becoming more of a common thing that I hear is that it's really hard to predict what happens once this type of technology takes over. Other technologies are
yeah,
we've been able to predict more or less what could happen, but this is more of a we don't really necessarily know because there's going to be so many industries disrupted by it all at once, and
yeah.
it's improving so fast. Like, is there a plateau that we're going to see, or is it going to keep going this way? Um, yeah, I mean, so regarding your time as head of revenue at Audiomack, what types of I always get curious about the internals of the company, and just like work environment, that sort of thing, the people that you're working with on a daily basis. For your job
Yeah.
specifically, are you seeing a lot of the same people often, or is that changing a lot? Are you in constant just meeting new people and on the move?
Yeah, it's a mix. I mean, we have our internal team, which stays pretty constant. And then, being in kind of a revenue sales biz dev role, I certainly, I have to go to whether it's like media conventions or just going to meet someone here in LA or New York for a, face to face meeting. So it's a nice mix of both for me personally. I think it depends on the role. I think if you're, for example, a developer, you're kind of more focused typically on that like internal team. You're not necessarily interfacing quite as much with people outside of the company. If you are in a marketing or sales role, it's kind of flipped. Usually you're dealing with a lot of people outside the company and obviously some in, but it's an incredibly fun work environment. I'm not sure I'm ever going to work at another company like Audiomack. So it's been an awesome time that I've had there. And I'm very fortunate that I get to work with very smart, and just really good people. I've definitely worked in environments in the past where it felt like not everyone was on the same team. I think a lot of offices are like that. Like everyone kind of has
Mm,
their like personal agendas and stuff like that. And um, I've never seen a company that is more in the opposite direction of that than Audiomack. There is really a
mm.
sense of us being on the same team, and I just find there's so much less of that kind of politics that I've experienced in the past elsewhere.
Yeah, that makes sense. And that's really nice that you're able to do that. You said that your position at Audiomack was sort of a natural progression to your career. Is there
Mhm.
another natural progression you see happening at some point in the future, or do you kind of are you letting things ride and you're liking where things are at right now?
Yeah, I love where I'm at right now. I think when I think long term, I'm not sure what the time horizon is. I definitely think about doing things outside of music. So, I mean, I am starting an app as like a nights and weekends thing right now. It's an e-com app for cannabis here in LA. So, like, pretty different
Right.
than the music biz.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, I'm definitely interested in other things outside of music. But at the same time, again, I've been doing something in music for over 20 years now, and it's definitely what I know best. So, yeah, I kind of wrestle with that a lot. I think about maybe doing something different in the future, but again, I feel like I know the music space very well. So it's definitely something I'm kind of thinking about. I do think like I enjoy working on the tech side more personally. I had a blast making a living as a producer for several years, but it's not something that I would personally want to go back to. Largely just because, like, I'm like closing in on 40, and like I was an EDM
Mm.
producer and DJ, and I don't know, man. The guys like Steve Aoki who are like 45 and still at the club every night, I do not know how they do it, but I'm not built for it.
Yeah.
I go to the club once and I'm hungover for 4 days now. So yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
I just think like I very much I really enjoy that part of my life, but it's kind of like a chapter in the past now. I
For
would like to
sure.
get back into making some stuff in my free time, but yeah, I'm not sure I see myself going back to like the creative side of it, but I feel very fortunate for having had that experience because again, when I think about things like AI, I think it does give me some kind of maybe a different perspective than some other people in the field may have, just because I know how tough it is as an artist. I think it's only getting harder. Obviously, you see
Right.
people who have breakout, moments, but one of the things that I think has really happened, and it's both good and bad. I think everything with tech can be good and bad.
Right.
So, everyone getting Ableton in many ways was amazing, right? Because it just meant
Mm.
that like you went from like a pretty small circle of people who had access to expensive studios making professional music to probably about 20 million people right now making music on DAWs. So in so many ways, that's awesome. And the flip side of it is like now there's 10, 20 million people making music, and it's like when you put your song on Spotify or Audiomack or whatever, there's 100,000 other releases that day. It can be harder
Yeah.
to stand out. It can be harder to kind of raise your hand in that kind of sea of content that's coming out every day.
That makes
So yeah,
sense.
there's
Yeah.
there's these like trade-offs, right? So, and I do see, I think you'll see some of those with AI generation as well. Like it's definitely going to democratize music making, but I think there's very legit questions to ask about like how much, and does it make it hard or impossible for, let's call them legacy artists, like people who, have really learned their craft and are not just using an app to do something, are they kind of drowned out in that,
Hmm.
in that noise? I certainly hope they won't be, but it's definitely, that's one of the reasons I try to use my Twitter to advocate for, artist rights, for royalties, for control over name and likeness. Like that last one is especially important to me. And I think we've seen some pretty crazy stuff happening in the past month or so with the AI stuff in that regard. So yeah, it's going to be, I don't know. I think it's going to be interesting. I'm still very undecided on whether it's going to be like a net positive or negative for the
Yeah.
music biz.
It's hard. Yeah.
Um, yeah, it's so early to your point, and like you also said, it's evolving so rapidly that I can sit here. It's funny. I have a newsletter on music, and I started drafting up a piece on AI last September, and part of it is I've just been so busy with Audiomack and some side projects that it's just been hard for me to find time to write. The other reason I haven't put it out yet is just like it usually takes me about a month to work on a written piece like that because I try to do pretty long form stuff. And a
Right.
month in AI right now is like it's like 20
It's
years of past progress. You know what I mean? So it's
it's
like
unbelievable.
I could
Yeah.
start something on May 1st, and then by the time it's ready on May 30th, I feel like 70% of what I've written is like, oh yeah, no, now you can do this with that tool you mentioned, and it's very very hard to keep up with the rate of change, which only seems to be accelerating, which is kind of hard to wrap your head around as well.
Yeah. At this point, I'm so used to that rapid change. I'm almost surprised when certain companies aren't putting out certain projects quicker or something. Like I'm getting used
Yeah,
to it now. It's so weird, and even most things. If I'm, for example, anything that I could get excited for, let's say a movie or something, you wait some time or whatever. But with AI, like certain technology or certain uh services I'll get excited for, and then next week it'll be publicly available and I wouldn't have even realized it because I'm expecting it to come out like a month, even probably more. um and also
yeah,
just the what the technologies are, they're just so crazy. Like Gen 2, for example. I know Gen 2 is not publicly available yet, but I mean, I didn't think it would be like even in the hands of creators the way it is now, and it's crazy what people are doing with it. um and
yep,
also, like, one thing I think, I've talked to a lot of people that do see AI, like they view it very optimistically and they see it as, oh, it's a tool and it's just like other technologies, that sort of thing. Um,
mhm,
and I appreciate that a lot, and I agree with the tool side. But for me, I think the way that I see it is that tool timeline where it's going to be super super useful. It's going to be quite short lived compared to what actually comes after that. which again, I don't really know what happens after that. But and I agree. Like I have tools right now that I'm using that are AI. Like Midjourney, there was a sample I was working on. I wanted to craft, like, I had an image in my head of what that sample visually entailed, and then I put it in Midjourney, and it came out with. And I think I used five or 5.1. I can't remember, but it was
Mhm.
incredible. So it's really useful for that for sure. But you know, we'll see what happens
It's also
months
a
and
bit
months from now.
scary, right?
Oh, 100%.
Yeah.
It's insane. Yeah, yeah,
And I think one of my favorite things to think about in music right now, just as kind of like a thought exercise, is like a company like Splice, right? I mean, this was a company that a couple of years ago, I was just like, man, I can't see anyone catching up to them. Like they just, Loop Masters had tried, and Native Instruments had tried, and they just had such a lock. And I think they still do on kind of
yeah,
the premium sounds made by elite producers. But man, there are people working on stuff right now which is going to let you do exactly what you do in Midjourney, but with samples, right? Like, hey, I want to
yeah,
generate 10 kick drums in C sharp that sound kind of like this Calvin Harris song or whatever your reference is, and it's just going to pop those out. And I really wonder what happens once that's good, because you think about a tool like a Splice, are you still going to want to sort through however many millions of samples they have and kind of search and dig for stuff, or are you just going to want to talk to a chatbot that just generates what you want? And different people are going to have different feelings on that for sure.
mm-hmm.
But I just think, I guess the bigger point is just there's so many businesses, whether it's streaming, whether it's tools for creators, just across the board, that I think are going to be really kind of disrupted, and they're going to have to really innovate quickly. And in fairness to Splice, my understanding is they have a whole AI team, and like they're certainly not like oblivious to this stuff coming. So they're probably going to
Yeah,
roll out some cool stuff for finding samples and maybe even doing what I just described. So,
yeah.
but I do think it'll be very interesting to kind of watch how different companies either kind of change with the times or don't, and how people react to that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, and I'm seeing, like, I do love seeing like, I thought initially when I saw how fast things were moving, I thought it was just, I was questioning whether it was just my Twitter feed that was, curating the way that it was curated. It would seem that way to me. But I found myself thinking about it all the time, like just repeatedly, like how, all the things that could happen, and then I go on my phone and I see whatever I'm thinking about happening already. Um,
Yeah.
yeah. Yeah, no, it's really interesting to think of where that could go for sure. And even, you're right, like a company like Splice, um and what that means for them and how they could benefit from it. um I do think, like, I mean, so bittersweet in some ways. Like, I'm excited for certain creators. I know a lot of creators do complain about, they don't have the money to afford certain, types of services, whether it is cover art or, mix and mastering, or, we could, I mean, the list goes on, but the way that you
Plugins, even, yeah. I mean, some plugins that are super expensive, like Omnisphere is like $500 or
oh,
49, something
exactly,
like that. A lot of people can't afford
exactly.
that. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So it's crazy what that is already doing. Like, even for myself, you know, creating images through Midjourney, doing it myself and trying it that way has actually been it's been really interesting. Um, so we'll see what that does. I'm like, I do use AI to learn a lot. I love to learn new things, so it's been great. But again,
Hmm.
same token, it's just kind of like, okay, where does that go and where does that put me? Um, and yeah, I mean, so I'm curious. You said you're working on something else in the tech side of things as well. Um,
Yeah.
is what does that entail for your role? Are you actually coding or involved in the coding side of it?
Well, that's a very good segue, because yes, thanks to GPT-4, I am. So
Yeah,
I can talk about
awesome.
that in a sec. One thing I was just going to add on your last point,
Sure.
I think, like, as I mentioned, since maybe September, I've been like thinking about this from like a writer's perspective, and my kind of like, I guess my core thesis on AI and how it's going to roll out at this point, we'll see if this is right, is exactly what you just described. It is, I think that everyone in whatever field they work in, right? Whether you do taxes for a living, whether you're a music producer, whether you're a writer, a director, like anything, lawyer, I think you're going to have a lot of very justified fear of like what this is going to mean for your job. And then I think
Mhm.
you're going to love AI for a lot of other fields that you don't work in, right? Kind of what you just
Right.
described, right? It's like, okay, this is really scary in music, but wait, now I can use it to make cover art. Now I can use it to help me
That's
mix and master,
interesting.
whatever.
Yeah.
And I think that it's going to be really interesting to see how that plays out, because
Mm.
that's what I've seen happening in my own life. That's what I've seen happening with friends. And yeah, I don't know what the kind of end result of that is, but I think that that's maybe a nuance that I don't see people talking about as often with AI is like, I think we all have this fear of it in our own fields, but then at the same time, we naturally and understandably think like, well, wait, but now I can just go do this thing and it's easier for me. And so I wonder where that all nets out. You know what I mean?
Mhm.
And yeah, I mean, as far as developing the app, so I had some coding experience. I will say, like, even with GPT-4, I'm a bit skeptical of some of the stuff I see on Twitter just based off a lot of experience I've had playing around with it. I don't
Yeah.
believe that if you've like never coded before that you can build like a really performant great iOS app or something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, you can definitely, don't get me wrong, you can like have it show you how to open up, Xcode is like, basically think of it as like the DAW for iOS apps, right? That's where you make your
Right.
code. Yeah, you can definitely generate some super basic app. And I'm not trying to play that down as something really impressive. It's pretty insane that you can just like talk to a chatbot and like learn how to like at least
Mhm.
create an iOS app or a website or a landing page. But I guess what I'm getting at is, yeah, for me, I had a couple of years of coding experience, but it was light. I mean, I'm definitely not like an expert developer by any means. Was just starting to learn Swift and Swift UI, which are the languages that you use for most Mac OS and iOS stuff. And GPT-4 was just like rocket fuel for me.
Right.
It just made it, because again, from my work at Audiomack, where I work very closely with our engineers. Again, I'm not coding at Audiomack, but I've had, so when you work at a tech company and you're making tickets in GitHub and you have to explain to engineers what you're trying to build, it teaches you how to think about like specking out a
That makes
product and all these
sense.
things. And so I'm very fortunate to have that skill set now, because that's a really good skill set to have for working with GPT, because like basically instead of talking to an engineer, I'm talking to the chatbot and I know how to kind of structure what it needs to understand about a project. And so because of that, and because I had a couple of years of coding experience, so like I very much knew what was possible. I just didn't maybe know all the syntax for how to get there.
Sure.
Yeah, I've actually done a lot of the front end on the app I'm working on, and there are actually things even at Audiomack that are not consumer facing, that are more like BI tools, biz intel tools for revenue that I'm building myself and with some of our devs now. So
Cool. Yeah.
yeah, I mean, that's where, but again, it's like, it's interesting to kind of consider that. It's like, it's very cool for me to be able to kind of accelerate my coding capabilities. But it's kind of the same discussion we just had about music, right? It's like, does that
Mhm.
impact some engineers' ability to make a living or maybe able to get some higher before? I think about that a lot. It's not something that I have a
Yeah.
great answer for, So
Mm.
I think that's just something I'm spending a lot of time thinking about right now, is like, where does that settle out? And again, I do think that at least to me is one of the reasons why things like revenue sharing, attribution, creator rights are so important for these tools, because I think that to not give someone an opt out of being part of the data set, to not give
Hmm.
someone an opt out from literally using their name and like photo and being like, hey, this is a Drake song. I know there's people who see this differently. It's just my opinion. I'm not saying it's right, but to me, I have
Yeah.
a lot of problems with that. Like
Yeah.
as I always try to just think of it as like, what would I want someone to do for my stuff, right? Kind of like golden rule idea. Like, how would I want someone
Sure.
treating my work? And like, I don't know, man. I'd be pretty frustrated if like
Yeah.
someone just trained an AI bot on Dave and like just replaced my job overnight. Anyone would be upset over that.
Yeah.
And I think one thing that's really interesting is if you look at the terms of service of, for example, ChatGPT and OpenAI and Google Bard, any of the tools that are out there, they have the same feeling about their work. In other
Hmm.
words, like you cannot, it's very explicit in their terms of service that you cannot, for example, take the OpenAI API or ChatGPT and like train your product off of its responses and then just like wrap that
Okay.
in a new product. And it's really interesting to me that they did that. I understand why, because again, I don't think anyone wants their hard work taken without compensation,
Hmm.
permission, whatever you want to call it, all of the above. But
Hmm.
it is a bit ironic, right? I mean, when you think about how these models have been built, at least to date, it's literally by just like scraping everything on the web. And those
Yeah.
people didn't have input. They right now don't have an opt out of most models. There are some that are giving creators an opt out, which I think is very important. But yeah, I guess my kind of the TLDR is just I think that if you are a company that is building your product based off of other people's work, you have to extend to them the same rights you want for your own work, right? If you're
For
saying, hey, you
sure.
can't train a model off GPT-4, I get that. That's your
Hmm.
business. You want to protect your IP, but so do all the musicians who make music, or most of them, and so do all the people who write code who have their GitHub scrapes. So it's just the same thing to me. So
Mm,
that is something that I hope we see going forward. And to
that's
their
yeah.
credit, I saw Sam Altman, the head of OpenAI, yesterday, basically say that that's coming. So devil's in the details,
Interesting.
but I'm
Okay.
definitely excited. I'm excited to see that things like revenue sharing and attribution are coming. I think that's going to
Yeah.
be definitely a step in the right direction, but it's absolutely not going to like solve all the potential problems here.
Yeah, well, I that's really interesting. I follow Sam a little bit, not as much anymore because I think part of when I started getting a little bit more skeptical, I was a little bit less I guess paying attention to his content or whatever he was putting out or the things that he was
Mm-hmm.
saying, but I do appreciate that he is at least making an effort to address a lot of the concerns that people have with a lot of this technology. Obviously he's very optimistic about it. But
Right.
it is interesting to see. And I think also, it was kind of cool to see that I think Biden had a meeting with some CEOs regarding AI, which was nice to see. Um,
Yeah.
so, hopefully there is something being done on that front. But
Yeah, and I think it is worthwhile to call out that there are really interesting things being built for software engineers, right? I mean, I use, for example, GitHub Copilot when I code, and it's incredible. I mean, it helps
right.
you code faster. It helps take away some of the kind of the drudgery of coding. I did I did a two-part piece with a couple co-writers for Water and Music. I think it might have been, I'm not sure if it was last year or the year before. Time is flying, especially in this space. I think it was last year on AI tools for creators, like so for professional musicians. And some of the stuff that people are working on is incredible. There's tools that will let you
Mm-hmm.
basically sample the vibe of a record. So what I mean by that is rather than sampling like actual notes and the actual sounds, you'll be able to say, here's my track in Ableton, but it sounds really digital. I want you to kind of make it sound like a track recorded on this console in the 70s, and like here's a couple
Oh,
reference
cool.
records, and it'll again it's not copying, it's not sampling in the way that we traditionally think of it,
Right.
where you're actually sampling like notes from the record. It's more kind of learning the qualities of what you
Mm,
describe and kind of putting some of those on your record. So there's going to
interesting.
be crazy things you can do with sampling. There's going to be crazy things you can do for all kinds of creative tasks. So I think those are interesting, but again, with every one of them, there's like a potential downside. It's like, hey, are
Yeah.
those vibe samples cleared? Are if you have a like one of the plugins I think about all the time. I used to use this plugin all the time for doing like pop like demo tracks. Was Native Instruments Session Guitarist. I just use that
Mm-hmm.
all the time to just kind of like if I just needed a quick guitar backing track. And when you think about what that VST is, it's just a contact sample library with some scripting. I mean, they did a pretty incredible job of making it very playable. But
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you can see how that's going to be replaced by AI that's like 100 times more capable. Like, I'm pretty
For sure.
convinced that I don't know what the time horizon is, but let's just call it 5 years. Maybe that's pretty
Mm-hmm.
conservative with the rate things are moving. But
Mm.
I think in whatever number of years, like you're going to be able to have just the world's literal best session guitarist sitting in your DAW with you, and you can just describe anything and have them play anything, and it's going to sound
Mm.
literally like the best person in the world is playing it. And again, it's like there's pluses and minuses to that. Like that's incredible if
Mm.
you're a producer who's not good at guitar and you're great at keys, and you just want to change up your style a bit or put new elements in your tracks. But what about the session guitarist, the real person that you would have hired before?
Yeah.
I mean, it's just like
Yeah,
there's
exactly.
there's all these trade-offs, and yeah, it's going to be, I think, interesting but also concerning to see where a lot of this stuff ends up.
For sure. Yeah. Well, you answered a ton of my questions. Do you have anything that you wanted to discuss or talk about before we wrap up?
No, I think we covered most of it. I mean, I guess Yeah, the last thing I would say is just on the topic of artist rights. I think it's really really important that people try to educate themselves on what's going on. Really try to push and push vocally if they're comfortable doing so for things like opt outs. Um,
Hmm.
for me personally, I think one of the reasons I've tried to be vocal about this is, I kind of started in the industry when piracy became a thing, right? Like I was in high school from 1999 to 2003. I know I sound like a dinosaur saying that, but that was literally when like Napster and LimeWire like became a thing, right? And so I saw firsthand what happened from like the pre piracy era to post, and it was just like shocking. Like it's honestly
Right.
hard to explain to people how bleak it was because it sounds ludicrous with how well the labels are doing now.
Yeah.
But I mean, honestly, in like 2005, it was completely unclear if record labels were going to be a thing in a couple of years. Like literally, people
Hmm.
thought that Universal and Sony were just going to be out of business. And I know that a lot of people have feelings about majors. I understand a lot of those feelings. I release music on majors, and like I'm not here to like um, yeah, I understand why people have those issues, but it's to me, it's not even about like major labels. It's just about everyone, right? It's about like any kind of
Right.
rights holder. That could be an artist, that could be an indie label, it could be a major. I just don't want to see us going back to a place where we're basically back in a piracy era, where like people who work incredibly hard on music just have their work just taken, and
Yeah.
we are seeing that right now. So that's where I get vocal. That's where I get concerned, and it's like I definitely have some serious concerns in that area. So yeah, that's definitely something that I think if you are any kind of creator, just try to educate yourself on what's going on and try to lobby as much as you can, whether it's to the people building these tools, whether it's to people you see building like AI music sites. Again, I'm not against people experimenting, but just give people an opt out. Give people control over their name and likeness. Like in my opinion, I just don't think you should be able to make a song that says like, "Hey, this is AI or this is so and so," and like put it on
Yeah.
Spotify and get paid for it. That seems a little sideways to me.
Yeah. I agree. Well, thank you very much, man. I really appreciate your time. Seriously, I know you're probably a very busy guy. Um, yeah, thank you for chatting with me about this. This is something that I really wanted to do, and I needed the right person to. And you popped up on my timeline, and it was like the perfect. You were saying the perfect things that I was curious about. So, thank you again for sharing all this with us. Where can people find you online? And if there's anything you want to promote, you're more than welcome to.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for having me. And as far as finding me online, it's Dave Edwards on Twitter. We'll see if I can grab just at Dave Edwards at some point as people flee Twitter, but I haven't been able to yet. um, that's probably the best place to keep up with me. I do my writing at daveedwards.co. But again, it's been a while since I've had time to update that. So those are really the two like main channels, I'd say.
Okay, great. Well, thank you again for your time, man.
Of course. Thank you so much for having me.